Hello everyone, we're here for episode 9 of the Exodus seminar, and we're going to pick up the story where Moses comes down the mountain with the commandments that have been delivered to him by Yahweh. And after escaping from the tyranny in Egypt, and after traversing at least a good part of the desert, after putting up with the trouble both of tyranny, let's say, and excess, licentious, and aimless freedom, the fundamental structure of the rules by which people are oriented, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, are about to be made explicit. And so that's where we pick up today. And for us, we're going to start with Exodus 19, which I'll read. And if anybody wants to chime in at any time with some additional thoughts, that's fine. But then we'll move to Exodus 20, and I'll just go through the commandments, and I'll go through them, and then I'll go back to the beginning, and we'll start discussing. Are we all ready to go? Yeah. Exodus 19. Yeah, well, yes, and thank you all very much once again for returning. And man, let's see if we can knock it out of the park carefully. So, in the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai, for they were departed from Rephidim and were come to the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness, and there Israel camped before the mount. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now, therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people.
Okay, forgive me.
Yes.
I wanted to keep quiet, but this is too...
That's not going to happen.
Yes, I try, though. I want everyone to know I try.
I wanted to make a comment earlier, too. So.
Really? This is of extreme importance in my view. If you obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession. So one of the most controversial things I have said in my career is that I don't believe in unconditional love. This is one of my biblical bases. If you keep my covenant, you are my treasured people. If you don't, you're not.
Right.
That's conditional.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the things we could investigate on that front is whether or not love, in any real sense, can be unconditional. Right? Because if the love is unconditional, it doesn't have an element of encouragement towards an ideal. There's nothing that's discriminating and judgmental in the way that's elevating, because everything you do is instantly, well, it's all loved. And it seems to me that there's a tension there between what you might describe as the archetype of feminine love and the archetype of masculine love. And feminine love is love for an infant. It's all encompassing. And masculine love, you could say, is, well, it's got that conditional element whose design is to further growth in some sense. So, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. Right, banging home that point. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord hath spoken, we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. And Moses told the words of the people unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto the people, and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the 3rd day. For the 3rd day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. And thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about, saying, Take heed to yourself, that ye not go up into the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever touches the mount shall surely be put to death. There shall not a hand touch it, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through. Whether it be beast or man, it shall not live. When the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount. And people went down from the mount unto the people, and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. And he said unto the people, Be ready against the third day. Come not at your wives. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mount. And the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. What do you think of that that issue of perishing there, Jonathan? So it's repeated multiple times in this part of the story, and it reminds me also of other sections that talk about, I think God only allows Moses to see his back and not his face because it would be too destructive. And there are later references to the potential for death to occur if people touch the Ark of the Covenant. It's something like, beware of touching anything that's deep and sacred, because it's so, what would you say? It's dangerous to too carelessly approach that which is most fundamental. I mean, that's certainly the case in life. So,
yeah, I think so. But I think there's also something else going on. We talked about this a little bit last time, which is that in some ways, many of the iterations of the story until now show us that God is in some ways too high at this point. That is, God has forgotten Israel. Israel are scattered. They don't have cohesion. They're not a nation. They're not coming together. And so now we come to the mountain, and you have a dramatic representation of that. God is up above, up in the mountain, the trumpet, the music of the spheres, you hear, he's the pattern of everything. He's the source of all things. And then he says, put a boundary around the mountain. Nobody should come in, because until there is mediation between God and the world, God will swallow up the world. And you can understand it. You can understand it at a lower level. I mean, obviously, this is talking about all of reality, but you can understand that, if you have a goal and you don't have mediations towards that goal, it actually will just be a judge that will break everything. Mm-hmm. So if I tell you jump 1,000 feet, that's it. That's the goal for you, and then it'll just crush you because you can't. But if I give you a bunch of ways to do it, and I put mediations between the ideal and how it manifests itself in the world, then it can exist. Well, but this is the ultimate version of that.
Yeah,
this is obviously...
okay. Well, you see this in psychotherapy. I mean, one of the signal contributions of behaviorists to the practice of psychotherapy was the notion of what would you call them? Incremental strategies. So a behaviorist principle is, imagine that we had jointly strategized so that you were aiming at something. Maybe you're unemployed and you're aiming at getting your CV together to get a job. And what we do then is, so the ideal is for you to be fully employed, and now you've even bought into that ideal. So it's an ideal that you're willing to accept as an orienting structure. And then you find that you don't do it, and you come back the next week to therapy and you say, I'm so ashamed, I was supposed to submit my CV to like 10 potential employers this week, and I did nothing at all. And so the first thing you do in that situation is you say, well, we should lower the goalposts. We should lower the goal. We say, well, you couldn't submit your CV to 10 employers. Could you even open it on your computer? Because people are often afraid to even do that because, your CV contains well, maybe the record of your successes, but also the record of your failures. And so you scale down the goal until it no longer has that face of the harsh judge that will destroy. And that's part of building those intermediary structures. And it seems to me that that's part of what's signaled in the idea of subsidiarity and the building of these. And that's I think you made reference earlier in one of the other sessions to the idea that that subsidiary structure was like Jacob's ladder. It's a hierarchy that reaches up to the heavens, to the highest point, that puts incremental layers in place so that that's not a judge that's so harsh that you just die when you're judged.
And it also lays it out. So when we get to the law, we're going to get there. When you get to the law, you'll see it's the same thing. God says, first he says, I am God, I am the source of all things, you know, you can't put anything in front of me. And then after that, it kind of comes down, then he gives you some moral principles, but even those, like thou shalt not kill. Okay, what does that mean? And then then it starts to unpack. And all the rest of the laws are unpacking and making specific something which is held together in a higher state, you could say, or a more contained space in the first part of the law. So the way the law is going to lay itself out is actually the same as just the basic structure of God on the mountain and saying, you know, it's like, okay, we're going to start, you know, how do we do this? Bring Moses up and now slowly lay out what that means.
Well, so you could view, please go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to change the point slightly, if so you.
Okay, well, so what we see happening up to this point in the biblical corpus, I've understood this more since we've had our discussions, is that you're seeing the nature of the spirit that unites socially and psychologically be explored using a variety of different narrative approaches. So you have the God that is that spirit that you walk unself-consciously with in a perfect garden, right? Say when you're abiding by yourself appropriately, and then you have the God in the story of Cain and Abel that judges you when you make improper sacrifices, and you have the God that calls you to protect your community when storms beckon. And it's metonymy, right? It's the juxtaposition of these stories to flesh out the idea that all these spirits unite in some unified and transcendent spirit. But then you have the problem is that unified and transcendent spirit can become so abstract that it's incomprehensible. That's the Deus abscondus problem that Mircea Eliade talked about, the potential for God to become just a spiritual abstraction and then to disappear into space. And then you have the other problem is that if God, the spirit that guides us, is conceptualized as the union of all possible virtues, then it also becomes a judge that's so harsh that no one can bear its judgment. So that brings up the problem of differentiation. And that's, you said, that's partly what's being... And God has to descend onto the mountain too before he can talk to Moses. So he has to take himself down a peg or two in some sense, I suppose, to make himself acceptable and understandable to human beings.
I was going to change it slightly, but so many people look at the Ten Commandments as central to the whole of Exodus, but actually I think the covenant in chapter 19 is even more central, and the Ten Commandments is the key part of it. But I say that because here we're in a country, this is the master narrative of freedom that has shaped this country. And many people don't understand the links. So I was fascinated, Leon Cass, who's a friend of several of us, he points out, you know, the Greeks had monarchy, aristocracy, democracy. They sort of run through all three of those. So Pharaoh is monarchy, ultimate tyranny. But when Moses is the sole leader, he's a kind of good Pharaoh. And Jethro says to him, no, you can't do it all yourself. But Jethro, in effect, introduces an aristocracy. You choose these good men to be the judge. Now, the covenant is quite different. It will bring in the entire people. And you have a very different idea
And it's
here.
a contractual relationship.
It's a contractual relationship, but unlike the Hittite covenants, the whole people, all that the Lord says we will do, that's the origin of the consent of the governed.
Right. Well, and that seems to tie into the notion that was relevant to, well, even people like John Stuart Mill, like founders of classical liberalism in some sense, that the the arrangements by which a free people might organize themselves politically and trade are dependent axiomatically on an underlying ethos. And that ethos is essentially covenantal, it's contractual. And that also ties into something else we discussed earlier, which was the idea that when God revealed himself as the spirit that judged the tyrant, and he told Moses to tell the Pharaoh to let his people go, he didn't say, let my people go. He said, let my people go so that they may worship me in the desert. Mm-hmm. And that's the idea of ordered freedom instead of freedom as chaos, which is just the desert. Mm-hmm. So, so.
God seems to need a people, right? Exodus is about the founding of a people. What do you need to make a people? In this story, they have a story. They were in bondage and they got let out. It's a heroic story, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's a covenant. I make you a promise, you make me a promise. And then the last thing is, what happens in this book is he gives them a bunch of things to do together to celebrate their new relationship with each other and with God. And that, so the rituals are vital because they can be the people, my people. And then they can remain a treasure to him.
Mm-hmm. How do you view, Larry, the relationship between the idea of a covenant with God and the idea of a contractual relationship and the later political ideas of social contract theory that people like Hobbes developed, that what binds us is actually a voluntary contract between people? That's not exactly what we're saying. There's a voluntary contract between people, but it's people in relationship to a higher revealed order. It's not merely a social contract. And so
in the American Revolution, first of all, those are two different things: contract with God and contract with one another, but they merge. And so when they're working out what they're going to do about the king and about the parliament, they're saying, we don't have a contract with him. And contract law, grandly understood, governs God's governance of the universe. It's wrong for him to do that. God doesn't. Because see, God has chosen to make his people free, right? And that means they have to be a party to the transaction.
Right. So that idea of the merging, just one second, the idea of the merging is extremely interesting because maybe it's something like this. So you imagine that there's this attempt to cobble together a vision of the fundamental uniting transcendent spirit, and that's a pattern, and that pattern manifests itself in multiple ways. But if it's a merging of the idea of the contract between people and the contract between the ultimate, then what you have is this dawning idea that the fundamental central nature of a contract between people has to reflect a transcendent order for it to be a priori valid. And we'd say, I think the way we would respond to that instinctually would be, imagine you got the better of me in a contractual deal. Well, the idea that you got the better of me is an indication that the deal itself has violated some implicit order, and it's in some sense unfair. You've got one over me, right? If it was merely a social contract, then, well, whatever we agreed on would go. And it can't be. It has to be a social contract that reflects some sort of higher order, implicit order. And I think those are the same thing.
But the contract is necessary too, because God made his people free. And so if I make you do it for your benefit by force, you're not a party. Mm-hmm. And God is apparently very interested in our being a party to the contract.
And I think it's important too to keep in, not to over. I mean, that we have to keep in mind somehow the absolute character of the divine, of God Himself, the ultimate principles. They're not conditional. They're not conditional on what we do. And with, on the other hand, the conditional character of our own engagement with that, which can happen or not happen. In some sense, it's like you can have a fire burning very, very hot, but you can be closer or further to that fire. The fire is burning hot, whether you are close to it or far from it, but you can choose to move away from, you might say, the unconditional nature of that burning, of that, you can say, of the fire of God's burning love. And of course, we're going to see here, just in later here, the very image of purification in the fire and in the need to abstain from sex and to wash your clothes and all these kind of preparatory, purificatory rites. But I think we need to be careful not, in any event, to make it seem as if God's activity is conditional on ours. That He chooses us, and then our choosing is within that choosing of us. And because of the weight of our will, to what extent we can engage with and realize, be realized ourselves in God's activity does in a fundamental way depend on what we do.
So there's still a voluntary subjugation to that,
yes.
but the ethos isn't a consequence. It's not an emergent consequence of the contract between man and God.
No.
So,
But Jordan, there's a contrast here with the Greeks and the Romans. In other words, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy is all about government. This is not. This is about forming a people. And the alternatives are, on the one hand, organic societies linked with blood, kinship, or hierarchical, linked by power. And this is unique. Now you have the Hittite treaties and so on, but they were very narrow. And I wouldn't use the word contract so much as you're doing. Covenant adds to law a moral dimension. It's a morally binding pledge. The Lord gives His promise, and they do.
so is the covenant what the founders referred to as what was self-evident?
No, that's the truths behind it. No, it's we the people. That's the covenantal part.
Okay.
But of course, the American Constitution is a covenant with the citizenry under God, whereas the Jewish covenant is a covenant with God. And that is unique. I mean, the Hittite covenants, you can cite God, but He's a partner in this one. He Himself is making a pledge.
And so do you also see
extraordinary.
that as counterpoise to the, let's say, the Greek idea that
Absolutely.
men are just the playthings of the gods, right? They're just arbitrary forces operating in the background who have no
certainly.
interest in a relationship in some sense.
Well, the
with people.
Greeks,
personal.
I mean, the Greek suspicion of democracy, certainly Plato and Aristotle's suspicion of democracy
Mob
was
rule.
that it was mob rule. It descended into mob rule because there wasn't that verticality of the covenant. That is to say, the idea that you have this flat egalitarian plane and that prizes freedom too much, raw freedom, that is not constrained or ordered towards any kind of transcendent.
So it's too much desert.
But
Yes,
you've got to
yes.
say there's a problem with this too. In other words, you have an ideal, each one, and then a corrupted form. And there's a very simple problem. The Lord keeps His promise, and humans don't.
Well, the Jews
it's not
put God
very
on
long.
trial, actually. It's
You
very
what?
interesting that you raise this, because the Jewish mentality is that He is obliged as well. And there is an extremely famous story of rabbis, Orthodox Jews at Auschwitz, the largest of the death camps of the Nazis, put God on trial for breaking the covenant. Elie Wiesel affirmed that this actually took place. This is not apocryphal. And here is the amazing thing. They gave God a lawyer. They gave God a prosecutor. And the prosecutor won. These religious Jews found God guilty of breaking the covenant. But here's the punchline for Jews anyway. And after they said, and God is found guilty, they said, and now it is time to daven mincha. It is now time for the afternoon prayer. He broke the covenant, but we're having the afternoon prayer.
But in the scriptures, the stress is on the renewal of the covenant with the people, isn't it?
No, clearly.
It breaks down.
Yes, I'm only talking, since you raised it, of
that's
the
right.
Jewish mentality is what you said. There is a relationship between covenant and contract. In fact, a man has a contract with a woman when they marry. It's called the ketubah, and it means contract. The concept of contract is very deep in the biblical and later Jewish mind.
And do you think that is the essential ethos of a contract is that it's a binding agreement as long as both parties abide
That's right.
by the spirit
yes.
of the contract?
But that is amazing. They found God guilty and then did the prayers. So you are guilty, but we're keeping our side.
See, it's possible. I mean, first of all, Auschwitz was hard to imagine the worst thing. But they were probably imagining we're all going to be killed, every Jew. That was Hitler's aim. Hitler actually thought God said he would not let the people be destroyed after Noah. I'm going to kill them all and then look up and say, how about that, God? And so from the point of view of the way the world looked to them in Auschwitz was, he's going to kill all of us, but we were promised not. And if he'd succeeded in that, that would have been a breach of the covenant.
Well, one of the things that always struck me as so interesting about the Old Testament accounts of the Jewish attitude towards God was that the Jews always assumed axiomatically that no matter what happened, in some sense, both personally and socially, they were at fault and took responsibility for it. And it was like the axiomatic assumption of God's goodness. And it's sort of like it's a statement of faith, right? It's the axiomatic assumption of God's goodness, all evidence to the contrary in some real sense. And I've been trying to puzzle that out because I do believe that it's morally incumbent upon us to do good, regardless, let's say, of the degree to which we're persecuted or insulted or tortured or hurt, is that none of that, no matter how intense it becomes, no matter how justified, I've talked to people in my clinical practice and my private life who were terribly tortured when they were children, for example. They have brutal histories, and you'd think, man, if that person did something evil, you'd think, well, how could you avoid it? And yet I've seen people come out of that who've refused to do evil despite all that, and then you're sort of starstruck with amazement at their moral fortitude. But part of it is the decision, I don't know how it's linked exactly, but it's the decision to hold axiomatically the proposition that being itself is good, and you're morally obliged to participate in that goodness regardless of the circumstances, both sociological and psychological.
And that's such a good moment for us to perhaps transition into 20, because it's precise. I would argue that you said this so beautifully here now. It's precisely the making of the covenant that you might say, in some sense, allows for them to receive the revelation of the law, right? So that it's the fuller sense of what this means and how to live within that goodness follows upon your giving yourself to it.
Right. Well, they've already given themselves to it in some real sense, because the Israelites allowed themselves to be led out of tyranny and through the desert. And so they're already on a path of faith, right? They've already committed themselves to behaviorally, procedurally to a covenant.
That's explicit here, because what does it mean when they say they haven't gotten the law yet? Remember in 8, when they say, and all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord hath spoken we will do. All that the Lord has spoken we will do. Well, what has he spoken yet? There's a kind of implicit giving of yourself to what's coming.
Yes, and it's action predicated. We will do.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And they have had enough faith to move across the Red Sea into the desert under the leadership of Moses. And so they've already demonstrated a certain commitment to it. At minimum, you can think about this atheistically, at minimum, they've committed themselves to the notion that the tyranny was wrong, they should be free, that's worth a risk. They've at minimum allowed that spirit to imbue them, and that's a demonstration, behavioral demonstration of faith.
Good luck acting as if none of those things are true,
right.
And then hoping that life doesn't work that way.
Right. Well, you could act out the opposite propositions. You could say, well, whatever tyranny you impose on me, I will accept. But that's also an action predicated on acceptance of a certain fate. There's a faith in that. No matter what you do, there's a faith step in it. So, all right, shall I continue, and we'll go into
the time in which we live is the opposite of exactly what you described, wherein if you have victim status or you are a member of a people with a victim status, normal moral rules do not apply to you.
Right. Well, and that's so dangerous, because I think also you're hard-pressed to find any individual person who hasn't suffered in such a manner that a story can be concocted that would justify their malevolence. And you know, Nietzsche pointed this out, I think, in Beyond Good and Evil, where he said the problem with deterministic accounts of, let's say, the linking of trauma to malevolence is that all events are subject to a potential multiplicity of interpretations. And so, you know, if you're bullied terribly as a child, you can derive from that the conclusion that you should become a bully, or you can equally validly derive the conclusion that the evidence suggests that you should never act like a bully.
Tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner. That's the famous French phrase. To understand everything is to forgive everything. And that's the age in which we live.
And the Lord said unto Moses, Go down, charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. And let the priests also which come near to the Lord sanctify themselves, lest the Lord break forth upon them. So there's some protection there, that idea of sanctification. I suppose that's an attempt to reduce the gap between the ultimate judge and the people, so they're not burned in such...
There's also like before the law happens, there's almost like something has to happen first. You have to clean yourself of what was there before. So you have to purify yourself, and then it will become possible, right? In the New Testament, you have St. John the Baptist who comes first and says, make straight the way, like clear out the space, because now something is going to happen. So you have to kind of remove, you can think about it like, before you want to do any new endeavor, you have to kind of clean out whatever you were doing before, you know, even at a micro state, anything, you always have to do that.
Right, right. Well, you might just clean up the surface of your desk before you undertake a new task.
Yes, exactly.
Right, so you're cleaning away the detritus of the past so that you can forge ahead appropriately.
Well, there's a huge aspect of humility in this. I mean, one of my brothers recently made a pilgrimage to the cave of Saint Anthony, the early desert church fathers, and the spiritual advice he was given as he undertook this pilgrimage was to begin from a state of penitence, and he found that unbelievably revelatory, because I mean, good luck learning what you don't know about the world or about the spiritual life or anything if you start from a standpoint of having got it all figured out. So in some sense, I think the purification here, it's not simply a metaphor here, of course, but there is a profound sense, I think, in which the
embodiment of humility.
Yes, the beginning is saying, gosh, well, what have I done wrong? What is wrong with me? How can I, how can I learn?
Carl Rogers, the humanist psychotherapist, attempt to delineate the necessary preconditions for successful psychotherapy. And one of the preconditions on the part of the person who was entering into the psychotherapeutic contract, let's say, is the admission that something was wrong and the desire to change. And Rogers was of the belief that without the person entering into therapy bringing that into therapy, there is no way it could possibly work. And like I dealt sometimes with, very rarely, but now and then I had someone in my practice who was court mandated. And that speaks to Larry's point too, is that doesn't work. Because you can't, well, they say you can lead a horse to water, you know, but you can't make him think, let's say. There's no forcing therapy upon someone, and that means they have to come to this place of dialogical transformation with the humility in mind. And the humility is, well, obviously there's something wrong with me. There might be something wrong with the world and other people too, but obviously there's something wrong with me, and obviously it needs to be addressed, and equally obviously there is potentially something better. And those are all propositions, right? But they're necessary preconditions for the process of redemption to begin.
Yeah. So, and if any relationship, frankly, imagine any relationship not in good repair, it's typically not a good approach to come in, you know, with an accusatory spirit, rather than to say, you know, what have I done wrong here? Or I want to take responsibility for what I've done wrong to bring about the collapse or disrepair of this friendship.
Well, it's very hard to rectify an argument, let's say, with your wife without having, and for her vice versa, without having that attitude. I mean, if your attitude is I'm going to have my way come hell or high water, good luck with that. You have to go in there with the notion that, perfect as you are, there might have been something stupid you did that you could admit to and learn from. And you can imagine that without that.
If you don't do that, you're doing something stupid.
Yes, and you'll learn that or not, I suppose, as the problems iterate. So, okay, and Moses said unto the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for thou charged us, saying, set bounds about the mount and sanctify it. And the Lord said unto him, away, get thee down, and thou shalt come up, thou and Aaron with thee. So maybe you could comment on why Aaron is necessary here. But let not the priests and the people break through to come up unto the Lord, lest he break forth upon them. So Moses went down unto the people and spake unto them. Why is Aaron accompanying him?
Well, what we'll see a bit later, there are different versions of what happens. And so there's a version also where he goes up with Joshua, I think, and at first he goes up with some of the elders, then they stay at a certain level, then he keeps going, he leaves Joshua at a certain level, then he keeps going.
When he dies.
Sorry?
When he dies.
Is that when that happens?
Yeah.
All right. So the idea, I think, is that he goes up. Aaron is like his extension.
Mm-hmm.
He's
his voice,
that's right.
Or intermediary with the people.
And that's what God is making Moses into for him.
Right.
And so I think but he's not, Aaron never goes to the top. Aaron waits for him.
And so is Aaron the political voice? I mean, if we're thinking about this subsidiary arrangement, you have Moses, who's next to God, so he's as high as he can get. But part of the problem with Moses in his position is that maybe is he in too elevated a position to speak to the people?
I think the best way to understand Aaron, if you want to understand what happens in the story, is that Aaron is an extension. He is that mediating principle. He's an image of that. And the mediating principle is positive because it's the way in which God manifests himself to us. But it's dangerous because people take it for idols. People see the mediation and see it for the thing itself and try to grab onto it.
Is that charisma?
I mean, it's whatever it is, it's just the mediation. So Aaron is the one that God chose for Moses to be his mouthpiece, and then he's the one who makes the golden calf. He's the problem of mediation.
Right.
He's the problem of extension.
Well, I've seen in political leaders, now and then, I've seen these are two kinds of political leaders I've seen. I've seen the political leaders who are the same when they speak to a crowd and when they speak to you behind the scenes.
Oh, and that's what you mean by charisma, like your persona, let's say.
Yeah, persona. I've seen other political leaders who have a political persona, and they use that on the crowd, and it's very unlike what they're like when they talk to you one-on-one, and I have some distrust of that. I mean, you have to have a persona to speak to people in some sense, but I could see in that the danger of manipulating that voice in order to look like the real thing for instrumental ends.
And you can be captured by your persona and actually start to believe that your persona is all that you are. And you see that.
Or you can believe that it's all those people can understand.
Maybe.
Right?
But in celebrities, you see it often. As they age, they become like a caricature of themselves. Like Elvis is a sad example, where towards the end he just kept turning his persona over and over until it became a grotesque caricature of what it once was. And there are many examples, especially celebrities. You see that happen as they get older. They kind of live in the idol of their persona, and they turn it around. Madonna is going through that right now. It's like.
By the way, for the record, the biblical, as I understood it anyway, or as I was taught it, the Hebrew Bible's division of roles is in leadership is prophetic and priestly, and so Moses is the prophet and Aaron is the high priest. So
distinguish those. That's a very good point. Distinguish those.
Well, they're not the same. First of all, the prophets are picked by God. Priests are not. Priest is completely hereditary. You have to be a descendant of Aaron. It's not enough to be a Levite. You have to be specifically an Aaronite Levite. By the way, Jews are to this day priests, and their DNA shows that it goes back to prehistoric times. It's a little eerie, because Jews call priests up to bless the congregation on holy days. And I always wonder, have any of these people snuck in because they just want the honor? And it turns out that with DNA analyses, they turn out to be accurate. It's not here or there. I just thought you'd find it of interest. But those are the two.
Is that the distinguished?
The priest is in charge of your of your man, in again Jewish terms, your man to God life, and the prophet, your man to man life. They're obviously intertwined, but that is a division of Jewish law that is very basic.
So
and you have women prophets too, don't you?
I think that's,
you don't have women priests.
That's right. That is correct.
I think that's important,
Miriam
Dennis,
was a prophet.
I'll embellish it if I may. A prophet is a revelator, and he's picked to do that. He's told things directly by God that other people don't hear. A priest is in charge of the rituals that constitute the common life that make them a people.
That's good. That's good.
And so Aaron is a much more routine figure, but nonetheless vital.
Sort of like the difference between Picasso and an art instructor.
But we have it in Christianity too. We have saints and we have priests. Like in the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, we have saints which don't necessarily have to be in any way in the hierarchy. They appear and they shine and they're bright and they inspire people, and everybody recognizes them in some ways as the true inspiration of the church. And then you have this hierarchy of authority, which we also respect and that we follow, but we know that, you know, the bishop, half the bishops are corrupt, half the priests are corrupt. We kind of know that corruption installs itself in this hierarchy, even though we know that it's necessary.
So the Egyptians, they seem to divide that in their cosmology into two different, let's say, divine forces. There was Osiris, and Osiris is the god of the state. And the god of the state, his proclivity is to become archaic and willfully blind. And now he has an evil uncle, that's Set, right? And Set, the name Set, became the name Satan through the Coptic Christians. In any case, as the bureaucracy ages, let's say, and becomes willfully blind, the machinations of Set can go unnoticed. And so Set overcomes Osiris and cuts him into pieces. And the antithesis of Set, there's always an antithesis of Osiris, is Horus, who's the attentive eye and the voice that can speak the magic truth. And that seems allied in some sense to this distinction between the prophet and the priest. The problem with the priesthood, and I suppose this is part of what catalyzed the Protestant Revolution, part of the problem with the priesthood is the possibility that the hierarchy of persona can ossify and then start to violate the prophetic tradition. And you see that playing out in the Old Testament too, because there's a battle between the prophets and the kings, even if the kings are in some sense instantiated by God.
The prophet is the servant of the covenant to call the people back to the covenant when they've gone astray.
Right.
And that's what they all do.
Right.
I think it's important to say, separation of powers. Americans think that comes from, say, Montesquieu. But it's actually gained from the Bible. And the biblical view is they have three crowns of government: the kings, the priests, and the prophets.
And God didn't even want kings.
They're a concession.
Right.
That's right. But the prophets have this crucial role.
But Aaron's a concession too, by the way. That's in the text. Aaron is a concession. Moses says, God says, you do it, and Moses is like, I don't want to do it, I can't do it. And God concedes Aaron to Moses in the same way that he concedes David to Israel.
But let me press this, Jordan, because the prophets call them back to the covenant. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. America is a constitutional republic. There's no one speaking for the republic. So you take someone like Lincoln, he was literally a prophet in terms of what he believed and called the nation back. No one's doing that today.
Well, I think there are, and I think
not at the highest
Americans
level.
don't want to hear them.
Well, that's typical
I
of
think
prophetic voices.
I think our age does have prophets.
Not at the highest level.
I'm not more optimistic than you are. I'm just saying, I think that if there were a true bona fide, God-appointed prophet, the Western world, not just America, would regard the person as engaging in misinformation.
Of course.
So Moses went down unto the people and spake unto them. And now we're at Exodus 20. And God spake all these words, saying,
God, not Moses.
And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So he identifies himself with that spirit of deliverance again. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. I'll go through all of them and then we'll return to the beginning. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. And all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, for God is come to prove you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. And the people stood afar off. And Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said unto Moses, Thus thou shalt say unto the children of Israel, Ye have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. Ye shall not make with me gods of silver, neither shall ye make unto you gods of gold. An altar of earth thou shalt make unto me, and shalt sacrifice thereon thy burnt offerings, and thy peace offerings, thy sheep, and thine oxen. In all places where I record my name, I will come unto thee, and I will bless thee. And if thou wilt make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stone, for if they lift up thy tool upon it, thou hast polluted it. Neither shalt thou go up by steps unto mine altar, that thy nakedness be not discovered thereon. All right, that's Exodus 20. So we'll go from the beginning. I'll start reading. When we have something to say, feel free to make your voice heard.
Maybe we can say just one thing about the structure of the commandments first, because we keep talking about this vertical relationship. Oz was mentioning this whole idea of the vertical relationship and then the horizontal relationship, the two covenants, we could say. And then the commandments are structured like that in themselves. So they start with the vertical. It starts with, I am the only God, I am God, you have no gods in front of me. Then how is it that we're supposed to relate to God? And then there's a transition in the Sabbath day, which now brings creation into the story. It says God created the world in 6 days. The seventh day you will honor the Sabbath. And then we move now to the horizontal plane. And now we start to talk about how it is that we interact with each other. So the the text, the Ten Commandments, are structured exactly in the very pattern that we've been seeing happening from the beginning in terms of...
Okay, so you see at the beginning, God makes the case that he's a transcendent unifying spirit, and the spirit that has already led the Israelites out of bondage. So he's already called them in some real sense and made his existence manifest. That's what they're following. And then you said, then the creation is introduced, and so is that part of the process by which that transcendent unity is lowering itself to the earth? Is it replicating that idea that the vertical axis is now distributing into this horizontal axis?
I think that's exactly it. It's saying, we could understand it from bottom up, let's say. We would say that if we want to bind together properly, there are a bunch of rules, like we said, but if those rules aren't subject to a vertical relationship to something which transcends them, then these rules become arbitrary.
They're incoherent.
That's right, they're incoherent.
Yeah, well, then you get the problem of the non-playable game, right? I mean, that's emerged in online communities, where the online communities are set up in some sense as a system of rules, games, principles, but they degenerate into a chaos because there's the unity that hypothetically makes the rules able to interact with one another is absent. And so when you iterate out the rules, this is what happened in Marxism. I mean, one of the things I loved about Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago is that he devastated the leftist notion that the catastrophes of communism were aberrations of the principles. Solzhenitsyn said, no. They weren't aberrations of the principles. They were utterly inevitable consequences of, in some sense, the fact that the spirit that united the principles of Marxism was either a malevolent spirit in and of itself, or at minimum utterly incoherent. And so, because you might ask yourself, well, why would we aggregate rules, right? They have to aggregate around something like a central rule, a central principle. Otherwise, they're not coherent.
That's right.
Yeah. So the coherence would be the relationship, the integral relationship of the rules to one another.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's why the way it's structured, this law, then in the New Testament, Christ resumes it to one saying. He says, love God, love your neighbor. That's it. That's the law. The whole law is that. But of course, it has to be shown to us. It has to be kind of exemplified in all these different ways for us to kind of get it. But that's it. It's the vertical and the horizontal. Without the vertical, the horizontal falls apart.
And a traditional way to talk about this is that the first table of the Decalogue is about obligations to God, and the second about obligations to one another. And the kicker is the funny one that's in the middle, because you can't, divide 10 things into two, is that honor thy father and thy mother stands between them. And the argument goes that just as God, after he sets up all this structure, this didn't exist before the book of Exodus, right? There wasn't somebody to talk to in authority, and he sets up all these authorities, but he's still working through the family, right? And so honor thy father and thy mother is the first of the commandments to one another, and the rest of them, most of the rest of them, support the strength of the family.
Well, this idea that, see, it's very interestingly worded, this, because he says, honor thy father and thy mother, and then that thy days may be long. Well, then you think, well, okay, why should you, maybe you have a terrible father and you have a terrible mother. And you might say, well, why should you honor them, and why should you honor the elderly? And one answer is going to be something like, well, your destiny is to become elderly. And so if you set up your society so that the elderly, the traditions aren't valued, and then you're going to eventually end up in a situation where you're the tradition that's not valued. So there's this hint of iterability there, right? And so you might also think too that capacity that we have to honor that which came before us, our father and our mother, is, what is it? It's an honoring of the fundamental spirit of patriarchal and matriarchal love. It's something like that. And it's equivalent to the ethos that has to bind us together, not only right now, but across time. It's something like that.
The fifth is honor your parents, and your point is entirely accurate and important. It's theoretically on the wrong tablet, because those are all between man and God, and then you have that. So here's how I see it, and this is not, I don't think it is even original to me, but I haven't heard it elsewhere, but I'm sure it's been said. The first 4 rest on the 5th, and the second 4 rest on the 10th. If you honor your father and mother, it is the conduit to God. If you don't have a father on earth, you won't have a father in heaven. And that the authority of the parent, Freud even, who was an atheist, made this point, how you see your father is how you will see God. Your parents are the conduit, especially your father, to God. And if you don't have that authority, you won't have divine authority. And the 10th commandment, the 5th of the second group, is do not covet what your neighbor has. If you covet, you will commit adultery, you will steal, and you will murder. They all emanate from the 10th. The order of the 10 commandments is one of the reasons I believe in its divinity, because of things like that that are so awesome. One final word on that, because I was going to wait, but since it was raised, which is perfectly apt, all of my life teaching the 10 commandments, people will ask, and it's more of a fun question than a truly significant one, but I've taken it seriously. Dennis, what do you think is the most important of the 10 commandments? I've had different answers at different times. Right now, I believe it is honor your father and mother.
So I read this great book.
I just want to say one thing. Every cult and every tyranny begins with the undermining of parental authority.
Right. So there's this great book, Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. And it's written in a lovely spirit, a spirit of generosity, which is amazing because Frank McCourt's father was a terrible alcoholic and he drank up all their money. He grew up very poverty-stricken in Ireland, and his father drank up all their money. He was a raving alcoholic, and a number of McCourt's siblings died, and his father left the family in abject poverty of the worst sort. And it's really quite brutal. And it's so interesting watching what Frank did as a child, because he kind of divided his father conceptually up into morning father and nighttime father. And morning father, a bit sober, had some capacity to love, and McCourt made a decision in some sense as a child to honor that part of his father. And you can see that McCourt was able to derive the benefits of the patriarchal spirit as a consequence of his decision, even as a child, to honor his father, even though his father was almost murderously dishonorable. And so one of the things Jung pointed out, this made him slightly different perhaps than Freud. I hesitate to criticize Freud, but Jung talked about the sin of the child in the Oedipal relationship. So imagine you have an overprotective mother, right? And you're laying there, you're a 6-year-old kid, and maybe you got a bit of a headache and maybe you don't, but maybe you decide you don't want to go to school, and so you complain to your mother that you're sick. And she offers you the opportunity to stay home, and you can choose to do that at that point, right? You fall into that overprotective trap. And so what's my point in that regard is that part of the manner in which you extract out the proper spirit from even your own mother and father, and maybe right from the beginning of your life, God only knows, is that if you honor them properly, the probability that that spirit of benevolence that's within them will make itself manifest is much improved. And it's certainly the case that that's true with if you want to straighten out your relationship with an adult parent, one of the ways to do that is to do what you can to honor what they've done for you. That invites them into proper relationship. So,
could I suggest, Jordan, that we, at least today, we go through the first 5 in order and make sure we talk about all of them? It would be a real shame if we missed one of the commandments.
It'd be a sin.
It would be. At least it's one way we could do it.
We're going to have to sacrifice.
I don't think we should miss any to begin with. And also, maybe they're written in an order for a reason.
Okay. So, James, did you have something to say?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, what I like about this thought versus Dennis's thought is the idea that when you get to the sort of, it's tempting to think with the vertical covenant and the horizontal covenant, the verticality stops at the horizontal. And I think what I like about this, what had not struck me before, that honoring thy father and mother. It inscribes hierarchy into, as it were, the horizontal capital.
Yeah. It's like a fractal. Right. You can see the fractal.
Exactly. It's not as if there's just a flat plane of equality once the verticality stops. That's crucial.
Well, and what do you think? What do you think the word honor means? Especially because we know that there's variability in parental behavior. So what's the injunction here to honor? It's something like to celebrate, like.
Well, it's not to love thy honor, thy father and mother. It's to show them honor, show them regard, perhaps respect the natural structure into which you find yourself.
Lift them up or place them above you. Like recognize their role.
Recognize that the limits that there are limits that are given to you and that you cannot simply free yourself from.
There was a chair in my house. I wonder if any of you had this, and I don't think it even exists today. There was a chair in my house was known as Dad's chair. The kids didn't sit in it. That is a perfect manifestation of honoring, and your point is critical. That we're not commanded to love our parents. People need to understand. We have to love our neighbor. We have to love God. We have to love the stranger, but we don't have to love our parents. And there is no other thing that we are demanded that we honor other than God. That is how critical the parental role is.
Do you think that the fact that we've lost Mr. and Mrs. is a reflection of that dishonor?
It's all the egalitarian thing. Parents and children, before my father died at the age of 96, I had him on my radio show every birthday. It was a big hit with my listeners. He was a character, my father. And he would. I'm sorry?
I bet he was.
Oh, yes, it goes down. It's genetic, I have to admit. It was like clockwork. I'd go, so Dad, and it really interested me. He was born in 1918. This is a long time ago. And even then, I would say, so Dad, what is the biggest difference between America when you grow up and America today? And I wouldn't ask every year, so he wouldn't necessarily remember what he had said. But every time I asked it, he had the same exact answer. And that was, the kids rule the house.
By the way, we have a dad's chair in my house, except half the time the dogs are in it.
That's allowed.
I may have mentioned last
because
time.
Because the 10 Commandments were not given to the dogs.
A terrible story of Salvador Dali, who had a terrible relationship with his father. And one day he had a huge row, stormed out of the house, went back home and masturbated and put his semen in an envelope, put on the back of the envelope, paid in full, and gave it to his dad, as if that was it. Whereas you think we owe our parents life, we owe them identity, and we owe them the very first beginnings in the formation, values and all sorts of things. So back to Stephen's humility, we owe so much to them.
This issue with Frank McCourt, it's so interesting because the fact that he honored his father was actually really good for him. Right? Because you might think, well, it's something that's good for your parents. They don't deserve it because they've been misbehaving so badly. But that is the fact that McCourt was able to do this meant that he was able to circumvent resentment and to restore his own relationship with hierarchy and tradition. Right? It was a real act of. It's a really remarkable book because you can see it's a real act of courage and faith on his part to act nobly regardless of the fact of the pathology of his father.
There's a wonderful book by the New York psychologist Paul Vitz. It's called Faith of the Fatherless. I don't know if you know it.
Absolutely.
But it's maybe slightly speculative and fanciful, but he does note, he runs through the sort of the history of 19th century atheists and their relationship with their own fathers. And I think Marx, Nietzsche, Sartre, Freud had terrible, abusive relationships with their own father, or absent. Conversely, some of the great figures in the recent history of Christian theology, I think Chesterton and Newman had very warm, loving relationships with their fathers. So I think it's.
Well, you look at the problem of fatherlessness today. I mean, liberals tend to say guns when you have a massacre. Actually, fatherless loners every time, almost.
Well,
see,
one of the things
that means, by the way, that's a very good point, and that means that this commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, is a commandment to all of us.
Yeah.
Fatherhood and motherhood are crucial. And, that's just written in nature.
Yeah.
Human babies take a long time to raise. Who's going to raise them? And if they're not raised well, there'll be a problem.
I think that's a crucial point, is that the hierarchy is not just any hierarchy, it's a hierarchy that emerges from the processes of nature, from the kind of creative conditions that God lays down. It's not a hierarchy that is humanly imposed or decided by society or culture or law.
Speaking of hierarchy, what do people make of the first commandment being, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me"? What does that mean?
By the way, in Judaism, it's not 10 commandments. Most non-Jews don't know this, and I don't have an issue. I always use the term 10 commandments. I love it, but it's called 10 statements because or words, either way, but they go both. The broth goes both ways. But the first is, "I am the Lord, the God who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." That is considered the first of the 10 statements.
Well, I think, Stephen,
Now we call them the 10
this.
suggestions.
Yeah, and that's...
Well, Stephen, surely it's the prime for the Abrahamic family. We're not like the Hindus or the Buddhists or the Greeks with their views of God.
Right.
You have a transcendental, unique, personal God. So Martin Luther, let God be God. Or Augustine, love God and do what you will. Everything starts with God. And the first word puts that right.
Well, this is another revelation, too, of God's identity in some sense, like a reflection of the voice that spoke out of the burning bush, because God defines himself to begin with. He says, "I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage." And so he's saying, well, I'm the spirit that frees the slave from tyranny, and that spirit is to be put in the highest place. Everything else of higher order has to be subordinate to that. There's a transcendent unifying principle. And I've really tried to think this through recently psychologically, because as far as I can tell, these are the options that are in front of us psychologically and socially. You're either coherent or incoherent. Now, if you're coherent, it means everything within you is striving towards a harmonious unity or has manifested that. That's coherence. And if you're incoherent, then you're a multiplicity. Now, the technical problem with multiplicity is twofold. And I think this has been established by the relative cognitive neurosciences. If you're a multiplicity, you're confused and anxious. And the reason for that is you don't know how to orient yourself in a complex situation, because it's the coherence. Even if imagine you're trying to get from one place to another. If you have no unity of purpose, you don't know where you're going, the consequence of that is that you're anxious. That's what anxiety signifies. It signifies disunity. So that's on the negative emotion side. That's chaos. That's the desert. And on the positive emotion side, the same thing holds true, because it turns out that positive emotion signals that you're moving towards a goal, a unifying goal. And you experience positive emotion when the distance from that goal shrinks. So you make a successful move forward. And so without that unity of vision, there's no way of specifying movement forward. And without that specification of movement forward, you have no positive emotion. So if there isn't a unity that brings everything together, you're anxious and hopeless. And so that's on the psychological front. And I think that's unassailable as far as I can tell. But on the social front, you might think the same thing. It's like, I don't know exactly what purpose unites us in this discussion, let's say. But if there wasn't something that united us, we would be fractious and disunited, and that would mean we would be in conflict. It would mean there wouldn't be a lot of positive emotion and enthusiasm being generated, and our interactions would be fractious and put us at odds with one another.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, at the philosophical level, you see that too. I mean, I'm thinking here of those early Socratic dialogues where Socrates is trying to pin down these Athenian experts over saying, well, you say that the Homeric gods tell us this, and then the Homeric gods tell us that, and there just doesn't seem to be any consistency here at all. We can't extract solid, stable truths here. And in the Euthyphro dialogue, he pushes Euthyphro over and over, and in the end, you get more to the point where Socrates, through reason, not through revelation, is saying we must be oriented towards some capital T truth that is unified, is transcendent, it provides a common horizon against which we can organize the city-state.
Through reason, but Socrates said all that came from a demon.
Right. Well,
he has his
well,
daimonion right next to him, that's true. Yeah.
Right. And he associated that in some real sense with the voice of conscience. You see that in the Apology. I mean, when they decide to put Socrates to death, he goes out and consults with his daemon, which is this internal spirit of unity, we could say. And the daemon says something I would say is irrational in some real sense, right? It says, they're going to put you to death, don't run away. And Socrates tells his friends this, and they're all shocked. It's like, what? They're only doing this to make you run away. You don't have to die. They just want to get rid of you. They don't even want to kill you. It's like, what do you mean you're not going to run away? And Socrates says, the thing that makes me different from all other men is that I have this internal voice, conscience, daemon, and I always listen to it no matter what it says. I've always listened to it. And for Socrates to say that's the thing that makes me different from all other men, it's like you should listen to that, because that was Socrates. And here it's telling him not to run away. And so Socrates does this strange thing, which is analogous to some of the things we've already talked about. He says, that must be right. And that means that everything that's self-evident, I should run away, for somehow that's incomprehensible, that's wrong. And then he starts to work through that. And he does work through it, and that gives him enough moral fortification to confront his accusers and to demolish them on the stand, and then to, what would you say, martyr himself in some real sense in a way that's made his name eternal. And
there was a contradiction he didn't want to commit too, because the charge was that he'd been impious to the gods of the city. If he ran away from the city, that would be, because they were local gods, see, that would have been a proof. And he was commanded by his rational sense, and he was commanded by his demon, or daimon.
Yeah, he insisted.
Do you think that's his prophetic side, that daemon?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and see, that's, those roles alternate, right? Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States is the head of state in America, and they're often not very good, but they're supposed to represent the nation and speak for the nation generally, apart from their legal functions. But sometimes they become prophetic. Abraham Lincoln was prophetic. He saw, if you read his second inaugural, right, he portrays the Civil War as a judgment upon us all. If every drop of blood drawn by the lash must be repaid by another drawn by the sword, still it will be said that the ways of God are righteous altogether. That's a direct revelation right there. And he was trying to find peace through the Civil War. We've all paid a price. That's over, right? Turned out it wasn't over, but it was significantly over.
So for the skeptics among us, let's say, the materialist skeptics, here's something to think about. So one of the propositions that has emerged in modern cognitive neuroscience is that whatever consciousness exists on the border between chaos and order. And this is not an idea derived from mythology in any obvious sense. This is an idea derived in part from the analysis of artificial intelligence networks, among other sources. But whatever consciousness exists on the border between chaos and order, and consciousness has a reparative function. So you might have unconscious habits that are detrimental that you can become conscious of and repair them. So when consciousness is operating properly, it has this reparative and restorative function. And then you can imagine that there's a pattern of neurological activity that constitutes heightened consciousness, and that pattern is similar across people and times. And that pattern, I think, it's equivalent to the spirit that's attempting to communicate with Moses and the Hebrews in the Old Testament. And so if you're speaking in a prophetic voice, it might be because that's the point at which you've become, in some sense, maximally conscious, right? Your neurology, the patterns of psychophysiological activation that characterize your actions have snapped into this transcendent patterned order that is actually the source, like literally the source of revitalization. And the idea that it exists on the border between order and chaos is so interesting because, of course, God presents himself at the beginning of time in Genesis. The Genesis story presents God as the process that operates on chaos, on the border between order and chaos. So,
could I add one more thing in the narrative of freedom? You know, earlier, the Lord introduces himself, I'm the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Here, it's deliverance, Exodus. In other words, with a free people, you can only be free when you're set free. And as you say, you're set free then to serve, and that service is perfect freedom. And they're about to be given this covenant of a way of living freely together.
right. Well,
But you begin with, I'm the Lord who set you free.
Well, it's interesting too because in some sense, that makes God, as he announces himself here, not exactly the God of the fathers in this sense, because you could think of the Pharaoh as a tyrannical father, right? And if God is only the father, then why isn't he the tyrannical father? He's not the Pharaoh. He's something other than the paternal spirit. He's certainly something other than the paternal spirit in its tyrannical manifestation. He presents himself here as the spirit that frees you from that.
But if you look at Israel alone, the Lord calls Abraham a man, then a family, and now it's a nation. And you're right, the contrast with Egypt, you've got this double contrast I think we're coming to. Egypt behind you and Canaan ahead of you. And they're very, very different,
well, right.
and you're going to be different
Pharaoh,
between them.
The Pharaoh for the Egyptians was a god.
Oh, that's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so God is saying, well, I'm not that. Whatever I am is not that. In fact, I'm the thing that gets you the hell away from that.
But I think that's why verse 10 is so important, because it recapitulates, as Jonathan said earlier, the creation narrative, but also God as creator, not just liberator,
right.
and not just the God of the fathers. And that, I think, that anchors, to answer your point there, Jordan, that anchors God as Father and source of all, the good Father.
Right, and creative spirit.
Yeah, and I think
right.
it also allows those of us who are not part of the people of Israel to see that the commands that are being issued are, as it were, plausibly identifiable as a natural law that applies, that will one day apply to all.
Right.
That is to say, that this is somehow the created moral universe.
Just one thing about this, when you tried to bridge the notion of consciousness, and I think that this is something which is embedded also in the commandments, which is, what we'll see is that the relationship to God is a relationship of worship. And it's a relationship, it's a certain type of attention. That is what is going to be presented to us. And God is not saying that there are no other gods in this text, in the first command. He's not saying the other gods don't exist. He's saying there are no other gods before me. There are no other gods that are at the level that I am.
Right.
And then later he's going to say, those other gods, because the angels are, in the Old Testament, gods, basically. The same word for gods and angels, it's just the same concept. But you don't worship them. You don't worship the angels, right? Your worship is attendant to the highest, to the source of all things, the creator of all things. That is where your worship goes.
Right, and that worship is an aim.
Yeah, and
that to deviate from that worship is a sin. That's why it's an archery term, right?
And then you can see
the
that when we talked about honor thy father and thy mother, he's setting up the difference, right? He's saying, you worship God, you honor your father. But then he could have said that of all other kinds of things, right? Worship God, honor you, the king. Worship God, honor the human laws. So there's a sense in which we do understand there's a mediated reality, but it's a hierarchy. What we give to God is only to God.
Do you think that relates to the second commandment, not to make any graven image of anything in the heavens or on the earth beneath or under the water below? I mean, that's moving from the transcendent principle, there are no gods before, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Then why?
It's a concern about idolatry, and that that's something we can definitely discuss in some detail.
It goes from gods to idols. They're different commandments. We don't violate the idol today, but we do violate the other gods. My contention is there are more gods in the West today than there were in ancient Canaan.
Right, definitely. Yeah. There are a
I
lot
mean,
of
I'm
gods
sorry.
of the stomach,
Yeah,
god of the gods of sexuality.
Or real one, Gaia, the goddess, the earth goddess.
And they worship
I mean,
her.
they not only worship it. There are movements not to have children because we're a burden on the earth.
Right.
It is the antithesis of be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Nature was created for man in the Bible. Man is created for nature in modern idol worship or false god worship.
We might say, Dennis, it's like either something is going to rise to the highest place or there's going to be incoherence. And what we're seeing in the Western world is both of those happening at the same time. There's tremendous incoherence of identity, right? And that's, well, the rainbow in some sense is a symbol of that. It's just incoherence of identity. It's the endless multiplication of fragmented identities. But then you have this other tendency lurking in the background as a counter response to that is something like a union under a false god. And the false god, I agree with you, the false god is something like it's nature as all benevolent virgin goddess. It's something like that.
Yeah.
So,
But surely the big difference, all the other gods are forces of nature. And the Lord of the Bible is the creator of it all.
So
and
the
separate from it all.
post-Judeo-Christian world
today,
is actually pre-biblical.
Absolutely.
We are not moving forward to secular atheism, but to pre-biblical paganism.
So do you think, Oz, that part of that is part of that the attempt to formulate the idea of the ultimately transcendent spirit as something that doesn't make us subjugated to the gods of nature?
We realize we're small. So whether it's fertility or whatever it is, you have to trust something bigger than yourself. It can be the sun or the river or whatever it is. And today it can be technology or artificial intelligence or whatever. But we know instinctively we need something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, and
that's
we try
idolatry.
And we try to make that thing now, see?
Right. That the second commandment is great for us because we try to create systems, perfect systems. We are trying right now to create perfect systems of surveillance, of control, where we think that the AI will take care of it for us. We're going to make this thing. We're going to make it out of our hands, and it's going to become our God for all intents and purposes. It will regulate us. It will show us the way. And so the second commandment is so relevant to what's going on right now.
Relevant to, we've discussed a little bit about the dangers per se of technology. You pointed out to me a while back that all of the technologies that are relied upon in the biblical order are the consequence of the activities of Cain. Yeah. And so how is that tied into this idea of the danger of the constructed order?
Yeah, well, it's exactly it. That is, the problem is not making things. It's not even making images. We're going to go a bit later down the text, and we'll have God telling them to make a big cherubim and put it on the Ark of the Covenant. And people will actually bow down before the Ark. And so it's not the idea of making images. That's not the problem. The problem is you will not make images so that you worship them like gods. That's the problem. And I think that that's the problem of the situation in the descendants of Cain, which is that in the descendants of Cain, Cain develops technology and civilization in order to protect himself and to rely upon it solely, having forsaken God.
Well, and then you have the Tower of Babel story, which is next, right? Which is exactly what happens, is that and men get together and say to themselves, we will build a structure that will reach all the way to heaven, right? You couldn't make it any more clear.
We will give ourselves a name. We'll make a name for ourselves without not receive it from God, but we will make a name for ourselves.
Right.
So then we'll worship God. Yeah. You can control the God, and then your God. See, that's
Leon Cass makes a point that has moved me to the depths. He points out that God is absolutely unique, and we are made in His image, so we are God-like. We're God-like, so we're not animals. We're God-like, so we're not God. Mm-hmm. But he says the pressure is to move two ways. One way, destroy the boundaries between us and God through the mastery of technology. That's Babel, that's Egypt, the sorcerers, and so on. The other way is to remove the boundaries downwards, so, we're just like animals and pleasure and all those sort of things. So, as Cass says, either we try and master by removing the boundaries, or merge with nature by removing the boundaries.
And instead of occupying that
dignity.
uncomfortable middle.
Yeah. And you think of today, the battle of the binaries. They want to remove every category, every pronoun, every whatever. And you can see this is behind that, and it's deadly.
There's a profound, I think as you were saying earlier, Oz, there's a profound, let's call it, philosophical point here. It's not simply the prohibition on idolatry. It's separating God out from nature, so that reason, thought, logos, divinity, it is in the whole order, but it is also transcending the order, and that's of course completely contrary to kind of a dominant sort of reductive materialism that we see in our own time.
It's also a remarkable revelation, right? If you think about it, I mean, you see this later with Elijah, because Elijah this is maybe why he's elevated on the mountain with Moses when Christ is illuminated. I've always wondered why it was Elijah, and then I understood, I went back and read the text, and I understood that Elijah was one of the first prophets who really posited that whatever God wasn't thunder, right? It wasn't the voice of thunder. It wasn't the storm. It wasn't the starry sky even. It was something beyond even that. And you think, that's an amazing revelation, because you can imagine for primordial people, for children, for all of us for that matter, to separate what God is from something like thunder and lightning, that's a very difficult thing to do, because thunder and lightning is actually pretty damn impressive. And so then to posit that there's a transcendent unity that even transcends nature itself, it's at least a remarkable leap of the imagination.
But isn't that the burning bush? Isn't that where it starts? In other words, not with Elijah.
But he's saying that's
no
when Moses and Elijah
expression.
are at the transfiguration, because they came to they both saw God, you could say. They both came face to face with God.
And as something beyond nature, well, the bush would have just burned if it was only nature, right?
No, but it's the answer. I am that I am, and so on. That's where monotheism starts.
Yeah, so that the ground of being itself is not captured in that, and this is
This
complicated,
is not
right? Because
pantheism.
we do think, though, so tell me what you guys think about this, is that I did a lecture at Ephesus recently trying to explore the nexus between the Greek idea of the Logos and the Judeo-Christian idea of the Logos. And there is an idea that there's an implicate order in the natural world that speaks of the cosmic order, right? And so do we just conceptualize that natural order as a reflection? I guess we conceptualize that as a reflection of God rather than the source from which God emerges?
What's there in the commandments with the move to the Father? That's exactly there. It's like, here's a reflection in the world of something which is transcendent. The manner in which you honor your Father is a little version, it's a smaller version of the way in which you would worship God. It's not the same, but it shows you how that order kind of comes down and finds place in the world.
What do you mean by emerges, by the way? The Christian and the Jewish idea is that God is eternal,
right,
before anything else, and everything proceeds from Him. So, did you mean our conception of Him emerges from like these big phenomena? Because the big phenomena do suggest something divine.
Well, I would say there's a notion that runs through Greek philosophy that the world itself is rationally comprehensible, right? It has an order within it that will reveal itself. Well, in the Christian synthesis, eventually it's to our own logos. But the notion is that within the natural order, there's something that's at least an echo of God, and an image of God in the natural order, like there is in us.
I mean, it's hard to pin it down. You see in the pre-Socratics, the Ionian philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, those sorts of figures. Heraclitus talks about a kind of a logos, but by that he means some sort of immanent internal principle of intelligibility. The Stoics much later also, which are effectively materialists, but they think that nature is informed by principle of ratio, and that there are sort of little local rationes, little reasons, but reason is effectively nature is shot through with reason. But they're kind of quietist on the God question. So now, I mean, Plato, in some of the late dialogues, I'm thinking of Book 10 of the Laws, he actually advances an argument for the existence of God against that kind of reductive approach of some of the Greek philosophers. And that is something very close to Abrahamic monotheism. It's well, let's say it's a pretty thick slice of monotheism. It comes very close.
I was engaged in an email discussion with Richard Dawkins, and I wanted to talk to him, and he said, I don't think I understand why you're talking about the things you're talking about, or why you want to talk to me, but I think it might have to do with this paper. And so he sent me one of his papers, and I thought, that's exactly why I want to talk to you, and you seem to know it, because you sent me exactly the paper I want to talk about. And what Dawkins pointed out was that in order for an organism to survive in an environment, it has to be a microcosm of the environment. And so he said, I believe this is an example he uses in this paper, and I hope I've got this right, is imagine that you were an alien intelligence trying to infer what you could about the nature of the planet Earth, and all you had was a dead bird. Say, well, what could you infer? Well, the bird reflects the structure of the Earth, right? It has wings, it has a certain mass, it has a certain volume. You can infer from the structure of the bird the structure of the environment in which it was embedded. And so, and Dawkins also said in this paper that it was necessarily the case that an organism to survive in an environment had to be a microcosm of the environment. And I thought, well, that's so interesting that you would use that terminology, because like, how far are you willing to extend that? Then you might say, Larry, well, in our is there a logos? Is the logos that's implicit in our biological nature the logos itself? And does that mean that the logos is the ultimate microcosm of the cosmos? And we're wondering that, because one of the propositions we're debating is, no, the logos is so fundamental that it actually transcends the material cosmos itself. So,
but if you scratch the surface there, Jordan, and maybe this is one way to respond to Dawkins, if you look carefully at The Selfish Gene or Unweaving the Rainbow, all of those books, it's very clear that he's got a very active and lively commitment to the logos in the form of DNA. Information, not material. It's as it were, it's contained in a materialistic, naturalistically explicable vehicle.
Right.
But information is the logos for Dawkins. He says, DNA neither knows nor cares. We dance to its music.
Absolutely.
But as it were, it's the logos, albeit understood in a strictly within as animating nature and nature alone, and not.
Well, and it is a pattern that repeats across vast stretches of time.
Absolutely.
Right? It's independent of its underlying material substrate.
Right, and it's one that evolutionary theory presupposes and can't therefore conclude to.
Independent of the substrate, I think, is that's fundamental to the second commandment. That God is beyond the order itself. Why does it go on here before the next commandment? There's this. He says, "Do not bow down before. Thou shalt not." Verse 5. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord, the God, am a jealous God. And then this terrifying line. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children. Not the children who did it. The iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and the fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Is that just a little aside, like better listen up here, folks, or is it related to the second commandment?
Well, I think it's a consequence. No. Well, I think it's related in that we could go back to the communist example again. It's like, well, let's say you worship a false higher unity, and that would be from each according to his need, to each according to his ability. No, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. So there's a principle there, and it sounds good. Well, what happens? You elevate that to the highest place. Well, it doesn't work. So what happens? Well, it's not just you that suffers. It's multiple generations in your aftermath that suffer. And I don't know, maybe Dennis, you know, jealous. What does jealous mean here?
Well, it does mean jealous, and it's an anthropomorphic term for people to understand. I love you, and I'm not into the love world as much as many others, but I have to be honest to the text. God loves them, and is saying, "I love you," and therefore, when you go to another god, you are disloyal. You're committing a form of adultery, as it were, and so I'm jealous. And I always point out in my own commentary and in speeches, it's the achievement of the Bible is to have spoken relevantly to people 3,000 years ago in the late Bronze Age and to us today. So clearly, there will always be times that there is language that we would not use today. People, oh, God is jealous. I get that all the time from the mockers out there, of whom there are tens of millions, as you well know. It was language that meant something to them. When you go after another God, what is he going to say? You know, I'm the one creator of the universe. I want you to understand that. And any other attempt to offer you a God is a false one because, and then give some philosophic reason. These are slaves from Egypt. They understand the idea that if you betray me, it's betrayal. He's putting it in the simplest level. You going to another God are betraying us. You and me. Mm-hmm. That's what it means. And it really does mean jealous. It also means, in later Hebrew, fanatic, but it really does mean jealous. I just, since I'm saying something, I just want to make one point on the gods. The Talmud has, the second holiest book in Judaism, has a brilliant statement. And that is, anyone who observes that commandment is considered to have observed all 613 commandments of the Torah. If you just don't have false gods. And I remember learning it in yeshiva when I was a kid.
Just
that one.
Don't.
Yes. And I realized that they were right. That was absolutely prophetic. We live in the age of false gods. I'll give another example to the one I gave earlier, science. This is, I get this, I have this, what I call my human laboratory, a talk show, because I talk with people, not just to people, and for 40 years. And that's a very, you believe in God, but I believe in science. Mm-hmm. This is the most common single one. So I have a very simple answer. Oh, really? God told me not to murder and to love my neighbor. What does science tell you? Mm-hmm. And I love silence on the radio. Mm-hmm. It is the most powerful moment on a talk show when there is no response. Does science tell you to be kind? Does science tell you to be good? To love your neighbor? Of course not. It tells you nothing. Survival of the fittest. That's the message of science. Yeah.
So let me push back against that just slightly, because I don't think it's necessary to take that pessimistic a view of science, because I think a lot of that's actually a projection of ideology into science. So let me give you an example of that. So there has been this idea, which I actually think is a Marxist import into science, that the pathway to reproductive fitness is through dominance and power. But Frans de Waal, for example, has taken that apart brilliantly in chimpanzees, and Jaak Panksepp took it apart in rats. What de Waal found in chimpanzees is that the stable alpha males are reciprocally altruistic and great peacemakers. And so even in biology, the idea that there's a survival of the fittest, and the fittest is like the roughest, toughest brute who could rule, say, the primate horde, turns out not to be true when you do careful observations of actual chimpanzee troops. There's something even in the damn chimps that looks like an ethos of mutual reciprocity. Now, it's not elevated to conscious, like to self-conscious representation, and I don't think chimpanzees are capable of evil, although they can be pretty damn brutal. But I would say even in the highest evaluation that science is capable of, you do see something like this recognition that an ethos emerges up from the material that's analogous to the ethos that descends from the heavens.
Forgive me. First, I don't think it's true for baboons, and so we're going to end up quite selective in which species we choose. There are many animals that eat their young. We're not going to use them as examples.
Yeah. It's not like the picture is clear.
And also, it's hard for me to imagine, and I know for you it would be hard to imagine. I want you to be kind, because I'd like you to monitor what chimpanzees do. Mm-hmm. Is not quite the same as the creator of the heavens and the earth has said, love your neighbor as yourself. And by the way, just for the record, almost no one ever notes this, even though everyone at this table knows this. Leviticus 19:18, which is love your neighbor as yourself, ends with Ani Adonai, I am the Lord. If that were not appended, it would be a worthless sentiment like cross at the green, not in between. If you care about goodness, then you care to have God as God. The biblical God must be God. No other God will work to make a good world.
Another way of putting that is, if we're made in the image of God, to elevate anyone or anything in his place is to demean ourselves.
Yeah. So the analogy there, Jordan, might break down because the image of bearingness, part of the image bearingness we have of God is that we are free. And that freedom is what brings with it morally significant responsibility. That freedom is what allows us to be the recipients of obligations, of commands. That's less clear of the rest of the animal world, even if there are degrees of sentience and
I truly believe,
self-awareness.
I do believe that there's a qualitative distinction between human beings and other animals, even our closest primate relatives. I mean, and
but there's an analogy
is,
you say to the emergence of certain forms of altruism among.
Well, yeah, I would just say that it isn't at all clear that there isn't something like a primordial ethos that's an echo of the logos that emerges out of the material world. I mean, you see this in animals' ability to play. You see this in the attraction to in so many animals to beauty. So here's something mysterious. Butterflies can detect deviation from symmetry in 1 part in a million on the part of potential mates. And you look at butterflies, you think, well, they're so beautiful. It's like, well, is that natural selection? No, it's half natural selection and half sexual selection. And they selected each other for beauty, and a beauty that's so universal that we think butterflies are beautiful.
In a way you think, in your view, eludes a comprehensive Darwinian explanation.
Well,
that can't be explained in purely Darwinian terms.
I think it can be explained on the basis of sexual selection, but the question is then, what is sexual selection selecting for?
Okay.
And it's something like, and it's not like this is trivial. There's a great video online. It's a profound video. It's this little pufferfish. They're about this big. They're little tiny.
They're very bright
and
pufferfish.
And they're fish, man. I mean, they're just fish. And this bloody fish makes this 40-foot sculpture at the bottom of the ocean that's a perfect circle with these undulating waves, and it spends like 2 weeks doing this. And it goes up and it looks at it, and it takes all the shells away from it so it's pristine and clear. And this is a fish. And you look at this thing and you think, well, if you saw a person do that, you'd think it's pretty good, but it's a fish. And then the females come along and take a look at it. It's like, well, that's a pretty good sculpture.
How great are thy works, O Lord? That's what I end up saying when I see a pufferfish build that. Just for the record.
Yeah, well, it's something, and there is this echoing of.
But I love Peter Berger's notion of signals of transcendence. Reality has certain things in it that puncture the secular interpretations of the materialistic, and they point beyond.
They do. Well, Bowerberg's love of beauty is
the ultimate one is the existence of the Jews.
But the reality is a key word here, though, that I think pertains to the commandments. I mean, I think the idea here is there's not arbitrary, things like, jump 3 times before you do that, and if you don't do this, I'm going to destroy you. This is not the logic that's going on here. The claim, I think, here is that these commandments are ways of accustoming yourself, subordinating yourself to what is the fundamental nature of the real itself. As sovereign, as non-relativistically. This was not a construct. It is not simply a societal norm.
Well, these are rules that will work in the real world.
Yes, and the pufferfish and the chimps are somehow within that same fundamental, let's say, character.
Right. And in terms, just to bring it back to the commandment, because you mentioned the idea of of visiting upon the third and fourth generation as the idea that if you embody a pattern that if you worship the wrong God, it's going to lay itself out, and your children will pay the price for that, and their children as well. But then right after, it shows that in some ways the good is bigger. That if you follow the commandments, that if you uphold the covenant, then what will happen is that thousands will benefit. And that in the sense that, yes, the evil will visit the generation. Evil does have a progeny, but that good, and that the good itself has a much greater impact. It's stronger, let's say.
But Dennis, isn't it a Jewish understanding that it's not sin, it's iniquity? In other words, there's a deliberate violation, and that does have consequences down the generations.
That's why it says to those who hate me.
As a matter of fact.
It isn't that I visited to the children. The Torah itself bans punishing children for parents' sins.
Well, how does that work then, Dennis? Because it's the third or fourth generations who
if
hate
you
God.
continue in the, you see, by the way, I didn't want to, since you're raising it, the Hebrew that is translated as visit, which goes back to King James, I don't know why they said that. The Hebrew poked means many things. You can look this up in all the, even English language concordances. Its primary understanding is remember, take account of. And that's a very different read of that verse. God will take account of. That could mean visit. It could also mean, since you come from bad origins, I will in fact remember that in the way I judge you.
Right.
Well,
including
also
maybe holding back mercy.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Right.
But that's why it's added lisonai to those who hate me. Only if you continue in the ways of your bad antecedents will you pay a price. But we do pay a price for Madoff's one kid killed himself, a 40-year-old man, and one died of cancer, which was I'm sure partially induced by the tragedy. Charlie Manson's son killed himself. To have an evil, it's bad, it's horrible to have an evil child. It's infinitely worse to have an evil parent. Parents don't kill themselves if their kid does bad. Kids kill themselves if their parent does bad.
Interesting. Third commandment, not taking the Lord thy God in vain. Why not?
Well, I wanted to start with that one because it's one that's so often misunderstood in a relatively simplistic way, because people think it means don't swear. And it's possible that that's one of its peripheral meanings, but that isn't what it means as far as I can tell. I think what this is more an injunction against something like totalitarian presumptuousness in the name of God. So one of the things I've started to understand about the atheists like Dawkins and Harris, and they're great exemplars of this because they were leaders of the biggest atheist movement, let's say, in the last 50 years, is that they identify the spirit of the totalitarian with the religious spirit. They think they don't just differentiate. And I think I can understand that because religious systems can tilt towards the totalitarian. But I think it's a juvenile analysis because the totalitarian spirit manifests itself in all sorts of ways. And to identify it with the religious impulse is also to fail to identify all sorts of other things that are characteristic of the religious impulse. But the point here is that let's talk about the religious totalitarians in particular. They take the name of the Lord in vain because what they do is they say, this is what I want. But they don't say that. They say, well, this is what God wants, and isn't it convenient that it happens to dovetail with what I want, right? It's like, well, I don't want power. God wants me to have the power. It's like, well, that's very convenient for you. And that, I think, is taking God's name in vain. It's like you're using the power of the divine to elevate yourself to the status of the divine.
There is proof in the commandment. This is a passion of mine, this commandment, because you don't know how many letters I've gotten in the course of my career. Dennis, a religious man, how could you keep saying, oh my God, on the radio? As if I'm violating this commandment. First of all, God is not God's name. Aside from that, that's just a technicality. there is proof that what you said is exactly what it is. Number one, it doesn't say take. This I know for a fact, and I know my biblical Hebrew. Lo tisa means do not carry. It doesn't mean do not take. Do not carry God's name in vain is exactly that. Do not do evil in God's name.
Right.
And by the way, that is the biblical word to carry. It is used all over. Laseit is to carry. Okay. So the second proof is this. It says God won't forgive one who does this. Now wait, so he will forgive murder, he will forgive theft, he will forgive kidnapping, he will forgive everything else except saying, oh my God, what a bad day at work today. I mean, it drives me out of my mind when God is depicted as silly, and that depicts God as silly. He is more likely to forgive the murderer who is an atheist than the murderer who murders in his name. That's what he's saying.
Right.
That is the greatest evil.
Yeah.
Evil
well, and
in
it has
God's
to
name.
be. It has to be, because evil in and of itself obviously is evil, but evil conducted in the name of good it's the ultimate parody of the good itself.
And it ends
has
the
to be
possibility.
darkest
If
sin.
God's name is darkened, then there's no hope for goodness.
And then there's in the text, I think structurally what you're saying and what Jordan is saying is there because if you look at how the commandments relate to each other. So God says, I am God, no gods before me. Then God says, don't take stuff and make gods out of it. Or don't take stuff from the earth and lift it up over me. And then he says, don't take my name and bring it down in an inappropriate way. So there's really there's a structural relationship where he first says, don't bring stuff up, and then don't bring my name down in an inappropriate way.
But you've got to say it all grows out of the reality. In other words, in Israel, isn't it, Dennis? Only once a year, the holiest man enters the holiest place and says the holiest word once. That was the reverence to it. And out of all you're saying flows out of that.
So why Oswald?
Because
why do you link those?
I think you used the word ultimate reality. That's what we're talking about here. Ultimate reality, transcendent, morally excellent. We're called into question profoundly.
Well, so this is an example of not doing that lightly.
So to abuse it by either making it casual or exploiting it in terms of, well, I want using God to countersign it and so on. But it all goes back to the reality of this. It's literally awesome. I mean, even the word awesome is cheapened in America. Everything's awesome.
Right.
This is awesome.
Well, does those rites of purification before approaching the holy, is that part of the process of not using the name in vain? Is that because you're showing by your actions that in order even to approach God, much less to use him as a weapon on your side, that you have to admit to your inadequacy and you have to clear out the detritus, and that seems to run contrary to the temptation to use God's name in vain. I mean, you see this, you were talking about Gaia. I mean, one of the things that's so striking to me about the modern debate is that no matter what it is that's being done to anyone, it can be justified, it's being done in the name of the planet. It's like, well, why can't you do the thing you want to do, emit the carbon that you need to emit? And the answer is always the same. It's, well, because it's bad for the planet, right? There's this use of this cosmic club in some sense to justify an ever-increasing proclivity towards top-down tyranny.
But in terms of what you said, I think this is something, the point you made is important because it'll help us understand what's going to happen later in the text, is that as moderns, we tend to oppose the moral order and the ritual order. We tend to think there's this moral order and then these rituals we don't even know why we do them. But in this text, what we'll see is that those two things are like that. And so the ritual purification, the ritual approach to the name of God, the idea that we don't say the name casually, all these ritual performances are there to ground also the moral reality, which is the one you said, which is don't pretend that you're speaking for God. But it does have a ritual version, and that ritual version is like a training, right? You can understand it that way. Ritual is like a training because you repeat certain gestures, you take certain things seriously in terms of your everyday behavior in order to help you in the moral world to understand it as well.
So Jonathan, I have a question.
I try not to say I try also not to use God's name.
Yeah, well, I don't think you should.
no, it's
well,
not. My
you shouldn't
question is
use
not
it
about
casually.
that.
I think that's right as well.
I have a very, this I've asked my Christian friends my whole life, and I'll just pose it. You know, we don't obviously have to spend time on it, but I can't resist. Given your true obvious appreciation of the importance of ritual, that it's not just the moral, but the ritual is critical. Do you think, so obviously my question implies I do, and I do, think that Christians have lost something in dropping the rituals of the Torah?
I think that traditional Christians have taken the rituals of the Torah and have reintegrated them into Christ. And so we have ritual, traditional Christians, Orthodox, Catholics, we have rituals, but those rituals have been brought into the light of Christ. So certain rituals are kept, and certain rituals, we could say, have been integrated in a different way, especially purity rituals, because we are the impure that have joined the flock. Then the relationship to purity rituals are different for the Christians. There's other examples, but ultimately, if you go to an Orthodox church, you'll notice that we have processions, we have things we venerate.
So you think Protestant Christianity has lost something?
I do think so.
Yeah, I do too. But you know, remember that the first Christians were Jews, and the story of early Christianity is them working out forms of worship.
I know. That's
and there were a bunch
asking.
of Jews who did it, you know, and it's got much...
And rejecting certain rituals on theological grounds.
I'll ask the Christians here a question. I've asked Christian clergy, again, for 40 years. My first program on radio was with clergy. And I will tell you in advance that the answers are 50-50. And it's no distinction between Catholic and Protestant, no distinction between evangelical and more liberal within Protestantism. Are Christians bound to the Sabbath commandment?
What we see in the early years of Christianity, in 30s, 40s, 50s, one of the earliest pieces of data we find is this shift from gathering on the Saturday to gathering on the Sunday. And so what we see there, I think, is an attempt, as Jonathan was saying, to preserve and hold the rituals enunciated here, but to fold them in and give them a Christological
and we do celebrate
framing.
the Sabbath. Once a year we celebrate the Sabbath.
Oh, right.
Okay, so you're
too,
not, so, all right, so are any Christians at this table feel you're bound, so this is not a challenge. This is, I'm in love with America's Christians, to be perfectly open about it. Not all, but more,
at least those around this table.
It is mutual. Thank you. It is a very beautiful thing in my life. But technically speaking, one would say that Christians are bound to 9 commandments.
Well,
because of the Sabbath.
Well, no, but Dennis, the Sabbath, the Sunday.
That's the resurrection day.
Well, no, it's a new creation. So the creation element is there, and the idea of the basic principle of the Sabbath, that it recognizes that moment in the week, that moment in the 7-day cycle of God resting at the end of creation, the culmination of creation. It's shifted to Sunday because Christ is seen as the new creation.
Right, so fine. It's okay. Are you bound? Is a Christian bound to Sunday?
Well, I would say it depends on...
I would say yes. But Dennis, remember, the difference between reality and ritual is in the Hebrew Scriptures too. And the prophets were then inveighing against the noise of solemn assemblies and so on. And Jeremiah's, there'll be a day when it'll be in your spirit, not just in the law. In other words, that's in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, there's no question that Christians overreacted. So I'm an evangelical, and many evangelicals vastly overreacted. I agree with John on that. And say the Sabbath. You know, I spent part of my youth in Scotland, and you had Sabbatarianism, and it was just heavy legalism, and it was deadly for a kid. And so many people just threw it out. They were throwing out the legalism, but they threw out the real thing.
Well, and
we're rediscovering the brilliance of the real thing.
That conflict is there's lots of stories of Jesus and the upright Jews, or the Pharisees, and he helps a donkey on the Sabbath, and they're very, and he heals somebody on the Sabbath, and they're very legalistic about that.
The Sabbath is the Sabbath was made for man,
Right,
not man for the Sabbath.
right. Christ tries to subordinate the Sabbath to a higher principle even than the Sabbath. But I would answer your question pragmatically too. Let's say not just Christians, but post-Christians. Are we bound by the Sabbath? Well, the commandment before that is, I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children. Well, you might ask, well, what have we lost by losing the Sabbath? Because we've lost it in a real sense. And I would say, well, we've threatened the integrity of the family. We've stopped doing anything communal together that is oriented towards a higher good. We sacrifice all the time instead of stopping that on Sunday. And that means we exhaust ourselves in sacrifice. That's for those who work all the time. And so are we bound by it? Well, one question is the theological question that you asked, which is, are Christians bound by it? But there's another question is well, what happens to a society that dispenses with the Sabbath? And the answer is 24/7 work.
Or play.
Well, or play. Oh, fair enough. But right.
Both are true.
And also, and there's a desacralization of the week too. And I think that's a real loss aesthetically. It's like, well, we remove the liturgical calendar completely, except for maybe Christmas and maybe Easter, although it's pretty damn shaky at the moment too. And so then what? Well, these days are arbitrarily special. That would be the atheist rationalist reproach, right? Why make Sunday stand out? It's like, well, why make any days stand out? How about they're all just the same? We just drown in this universality of idiot sameness. And that's the replacement for the sacred. And then people think, well, I'm without meaning. My life was without meaning. It's like, well, it's no wonder, man. You chased all of it away.
Yeah. But then at the end of that actually is because that doesn't hold. So at the end of that is a resacralization, and that's what we're seeing happen now.
Yeah.
And so we will have a liturgical calendar.
Well, we do.
It's going
now.
to be a rainbow-colored one. That's the liturgical
But
calendar.
Dennis, I know a lot of Christians wrestling with what the Sabbath means and trying to rediscover. I mean, it's a totally different view of time.
That's right.
As well as
It's
work
the first
and
sanctification of
accomplishment.
time in history.
And even equality. And so the slaves and the servants,
That's right.
they rest too.
And the animals.
And the animals.
Nobody real animals made it into the
So
Ten Commandments.
Rabbi Sachs calls this utopia now. It's a glimpse forward.
It is. For those
what
of us
will
who
come.
have it, I just need to say, I'm going to make an advertisement. Every Christian should have a Sabbath in his life.
Absolutely.
There should be a sacred 24-hour period. When I would ask the Christian clergy on this program that I did on radio for 10 years, I'd say, if I went to your house on a Sunday after church, and I would ask this to clergy, priests and ministers, if I went to your house Sunday afternoon after church, how would I know it's Sunday and not another day? Mm-hmm. And they almost all, to a person, had the answer, well, you wouldn't see it. It's in my heart. And for a Jew, that doesn't make an answer. It's like, how do I know I love my wife? I don't show it, but it's in my heart. Is not a good answer.
Generally not a very good answer for your wife either.
That's I was speaking on the wife's behalf.
Yes. I never show her, but I feel it in my heart.
You're watching the NFL game of the week. The football, for those outside of America, National Football League Game of the Week. I'm sorry?
There's an idol.
Well, okay, it's not as dangerous as some of the others, but you're
the
absolutely
New Orleans
right.
Saints.
But I just want to say, the answer, it's in my heart, didn't strike me as real. What is it? How is it in your heart? I was given tickets. It's on the internet for those who are watching this or listening and want to see it. It's called Higher Than the Angels. I wrote this 18 years ago, one of my weekly column. I was an Angels fan because they were the less popular team in Southern California. And they finally made it to the playoffs against the Yankees, which was to me a mitzvah that they beat the Yankees. Mitzvah is Jewish commandment, good deed. And a friend of mine, Hugh Hewitt, a fellow talk show host, Dennis, I can't go to the game. I have 2 tickets for you for the playoff game against the Yankees. I go, wow. He goes, so I go, when is it? He goes, Saturday afternoon. Now, I don't do everything Orthodox Jews do or on the Sabbath, but I don't go to sporting events or watch them on TV. I just can't reconcile that with make the day holy. And so I wrote this column, Higher Than the Angels. The Sabbath was higher than the angels. If you don't believe that God said keep the Sabbath, you will go to that game. And it was so interesting to get Christians' reactions to me. Well, wasn't that a bonding experience with your son? Wouldn't you have gone with your son? I say, yeah, but it doesn't compare to the bonding experience of Shabbat every week.
Yeah,
I don't need
is,
a baseball bonding experience.
This is something that Jonathan has really helped me understand too, is that we have this idea, and I think it's very, very characteristic of a kind of fractionating Protestant liberalism, that you hold the highest truths in your heart. But it sort of begs the question is, well, how do you keep them in your heart? And to some degree, that has to be, unless they're stamped
behavior
on there in some magical way, yeah,
right.
Well, it has to be ritualized. It has to be turned into something that the whole community partakes in.
I think that's why the sequencing of the commandments is so interesting, because the first commandment is really a commandment about one's interior disposition, right? The sense of our disposition, our alignment, a kind of cognitive and affective alignment towards the divine. And then the next few commandments are shifting to exterior forms of behavior. Mm-hmm. That is to say, it's got to be, and ultimately to ritual. Mm-hmm. So it's got to be that sort of inner psychological, settled moral orientation, and then that is going to work itself out in external forms of behavior.
So even if there's an echo there in the psyche, let's say, that has to be manifested in action and communion and ritual that's individual and collective.
That's right.
To keep that concordance in place.
Exactly. Right? So that the breaking of the failure to conform to those forms of the patterns of external behavior is going to be a sign that there's some kind of inner restlessness within, and a failure to keep the commands of interiority at the beginning.
Yeah, well, and it is an open question in our culture how much this so-called crisis of meaning that we're all in is a consequence not so much of the collapse of belief, although it's certainly that, but of the collapse of ritual, both private and collective. One of the things you notice, one of the things you conclude if you're a psychologist who's interested in the development of children, is that one of the things that gives children safety and security and the ability to explore is the establishment of predictable rituals, right? It's like, well, you want happy children? Feed them the same time every day. You want to vary that a bit so they can get used to some, relative privation. They need to get up at the same time every day. They need to eat at the same time every day with the same people. They have to have the same caregivers. They have to go to bed at the same time. They have to have a story read to them, sometimes the same story, sometimes in the same way. And you think, well, that's just arbitrary constraint on their natural proclivity to creative glory. It's like, no, that ritualization is a precondition for the emergence of the spirit that can be properly and voluntarily adventurous, right? It's not constraint and restriction. It's the establishment of necessary predictability.
Yeah. Well, think of a family meal. A family meal is a great example. A family meal is extremely ritualized. Mm-hmm. You have certain ways that we sit in a certain manner. You don't want to talk too much. You want to let the other people speak. There's a way to comport yourself. And imagine a bigger family meal, there's certain rituals. If everybody brings food, you got to make sure you take a bit of everybody's food because you will offend everybody. And so that ritualization is necessary for the love and the communion to exist in the family meal.
And if everyone understands those rituals and abides by them, the meal tends to be a lot more peaceful. How many of you sat around a family table regularly when you were growing up? I presume all of you. Okay. Do you remember, did you always sit in the same chair?
Yeah.
Right, so that's so interesting. And you see this, I saw this happen in classrooms continually. The kids would come into the class and the chair they picked the first day, that was their chair, right? Instantaneous ritualization. And it's part of a proclivity to dispense with unnecessary complexity, right? And so, but you do, and I can remember at our tables, like if my sister would tease me and sit in my chair, my objection was, that's my chair. That was an objection that was upheld even by her, but also by my parents. It's like, get out of Jordan's chair, right? And so, and the fact that it's not like we had come to some contractual agreement that we each had our chair. And we all knew it was arbitrary in some sense, but still that ritualization, so much of what constitutes peace is actually ritualization, so much of it.
It feels like we can go even deeper into this, though, almost more basically into it, and that, of course, we need the ritualization of all kinds of things in our lives, but this is about specifically the ritualization of rest. And some of the commandments are negative, right? The prohibitions: don't do this, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, etc. This is one of the positive ones. keep the Sabbath. And
there are only two positive: this and parents.
And the parents, and it's keep.
Those are also the two longest ones.
Yes, and so when he says keep the Sabbath, he's not saying work is bad. 6 days you do your work, but keep the Sabbath holy. And I'm wondering, why do you have to stop work to enter into or remember, to ritualize the space of holiness that in some sense maybe makes sense of everything else?
God gives the answer. It's the only one he explains of all the commandments. I stopped working, you stop working. This oath, okay, I'm sorry, I lapsed into the Hebrew. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever, that in 6 days I created the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh I rested. When you keep the Sabbath, you are announcing I created the world. In my home, when we would make the blessing over the wine at the beginning of the Shabbat meal, I said, now let's all stand and affirm that God created the world, not chance. My kids would always chime in, and not chance. Like, there goes Dad again with his ritualized announcement. But to this day, they go, and not chance. And it is the undoing of everything they will learn at the secular university, that chance created the world and not God.
Well, one of the things that I've thought about in my contemplation of the deterioration of collective religious worship is a materialist, atheist, cynical response to Sunday Christians. And so the response was, this was very widespread in my youth, when many more people went to church, was that, well, that's all well and good for you hypocrites, because, once a week you go to church and you go there for an hour and you mouth some meaningless words and you pretend to be virtuous, and then you go off and you continue in your sinful ways just like everyone else. And I thought, that idea had a certain amount of attraction for me, I think, when I was 13, because I did...
Because you were 13.
Well, yes. But then I realized later, when I was really thinking through it, it's like, well, maybe an hour a week turning your attention towards something that's hypothetically higher in the stupid way that you're likely to manage it beats the hell out of never, ever doing it for a minute at all under any circumstances whatsoever, right? That sort of formulaic striving forward, even in that hypocritical and even banally ritualized sense, is, well, what are you going to replace it? Will you replace that with nothing? How is that an improvement? Well, it's not hypocritical. It's like, well, it's lower than hypocritical. There's not even a striving against which you could fail. And I don't see that as an improvement.
So can I ask, just to really break this down, and to confess amongst my brothers here, I really struggle with this personally, the Sabbath. I mean, struggle personally to take a Sabbath. And maybe I'm not the only one with iPhones and constant distractions, and I have a busy job, and it's important. I think the work I'm doing is important. As if you're lucky to have work that you cherish, it's good to do that work, and there's always a reason to keep working on Sunday. If you don't do that, then you think that. So what I want to ask humbly of all of you, what are your own practices? What makes
That's what I asked.
What makes a
I'm
good
glad
Sabbath?
you're asking, and God bless you for struggling.
I'm very bad at it too. And I know this is wrong. When one of the things I did as a clinical psychologist is I had all these high-end lawyers in my practice, and they were usually senior partners of large law firms. And the deal was that we made with the firms was, you send us your best people and we will make them more productive. they'll have more billable hours, but we work for them. We're not working for you. And so I faced this conundrum with my clients because these were people who were worth a lot of money per hour. And they were making $750 to $2,000 an hour. And they were working 16-hour days. I mean, I had a woman, one of my clients, she bought a new microwave because she could microwave her coffee in 10 seconds instead of 20 seconds in the morning. Like, I mean, her life was scheduled. She was hyper-productive. And a lot of these people struggled, as you might expect, with work-life balance, that cliche. And one of the things I learned quite rapidly was that I could get these people to schedule out vacations 2 or 3 months in advance because they couldn't work fewer hours a day. The competition was just too intense. And it wasn't even easy for them to work fewer hours a week. But if they scheduled 3 months ahead, they could take 3 or 4 days, and then they could do that. And what we invariably found was, and this is something to think about when you're being driven by that demon of work, is they became more productive. So they got a rest and their billable hours went up because the gain they obtained in efficiency more than, well, and right, it's not surprising in some sense, right? But it was interesting to see that so starkly indicated even to these people. And so you might ask yourself, is like, well, you have all these wonderful opportunities and you want to have your nose to the grindstone and make sacrifices to the proper gods, but it could be that if you took a day off a week, which I don't do, by the way, you'd be much better at that. Also because you'd have the opportunity now and then to stop focusing so intensely on the task at hand and to allow yourself to emerge into a state of contemplative reverie, which is indistinguishable from the freedom you need to be creative.
But no argument, every argument you made is impeccable, and none will change his behavior. That's, well, for good reason. But this is critical. The only reason I don't work 7 days a week is because I think God commanded me. The only reason that we have the meals with our kids as intently as we did, and every Jewish family is the same that has this, they're at least 3 hours. You just sit and talk. From everything from, is there an afterlife, to how the local baseball team did. Everything is talked about. I learned how to think at the Shabbat table, not at school. Because my father and my brother would talk. My brother's 6 years older than me, went to Columbia, then Harvard, big intellectual. They would have these discussions. Finally, in middle teenage, I started to pipe up, and my father would look at me and go, that's nonsense. And I learned to say to myself, that's nonsense at the Shabbat table, not at school. Only because God says keep it, do we keep it? Do I keep it?
Work and play. So we had an interesting argument. Let's say that there's another college with which we have cooperation, and they won't play sports on Sunday. And some people don't like that, and so another college president discovered that they actually did play sports on Sunday sometimes. And I don't care about that very much for a reason I'm about to state. But then I get a letter from the college president written on a Sunday. And it says, I've discovered this thing and I'm shocked and horrified and it will never happen again. And we got to talking about that and somewhat laughing about that at our staff meeting, because several people in the room who are very devout Christians, they think it's okay to play on Sunday. It's not okay to work, right? And so there you go. And you know, that's a fair reading of this, by the way.
Well, it depends on whether you think play is holy.
The fairest reading is the commandment: keep the day holy.
Right.
That's the commandment. Yeah. And it's playing to go to the Angels game. That was total play. But I didn't do it because it didn't make the day holy.
But for Christians, I mean, I think, Stephen, going to church is definitely part of it. And one of the things we do in our parish, which is helpful to do that, is that we have, because we fast before the ceremony, then we have a meal together. So we go to church, then we have a meal in church with everybody, and then that will force you, I mean, it doesn't force you, but it forces your day to go up to 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then you go back home, and then you just sit with the family, and that helps to kind of make it into a day of rest. And that's one of the reasons why the church, we all go to church on Sunday.
I very much agree that I mean, first of all, I remember that I agree that the Sabbath should be kept holy, but another advantage, because see, I think many things in the Old Testament are interested in public health and have a fair sense of it, you know, what to eat, stuff like that. And so, sure enough, you need to know your children and your wife. When are you going to know them? How are you going to get to know them? And if you don't sit and talk with them, you won't know them. My house is revolutionized because my 2 grandchildren live 4 blocks away. And my wife says, wow, this is harder now, you know? But we know those grandchildren, and they're over a lot, and especially on Sunday.
Well, so what do we think about what this means to keep it holy? I mean, we're having a bit of a discussion about whether play, at least in some of its forms, can partake of the holy, and you're a little doubtful on that front with regards to professional sports viewing, for example, but I would say, you know, some forms of play seem to verge on the holy.
Yes.
Music has that element.
All the families will play board games, for example.
Right,
They'll play
okay.
Scrabble.
So
Yep.
maybe we could talk for a minute or two. Oz, maybe you could kick us off here. Is like, if we're supposed to keep a day holy, and in the modern world, well, we don't even know what that means. What do you mean holy? And Jonathan, you said, well, maybe you dedicate some of it to church, and that seems in a sense like an obvious pathway to that which is holy. But what do we mean by keep it holy?
Well, let's go back to the Lord is holy, and we're to be like him. And the essence of holiness in Hebrew, Janice, you'd have to come in again, is the set-apartness.
Correct.
The distinct uniqueness of it. Now, in English, my growing up, it became a sort of uncomfortable form of goody-goodiness.
Yes.
And then holier than thou.
Right.
But that idea of distinct, you could say, countercultural set-apartness.
Yeah.
We should be countercultural
That's it. You hit it on the
people.
nose. Baseball is every day. Scrabble with the family is not every day. They would never play it if it were not Shabbat.
So part of it is that it should be, it's bounded in some sense from the activities that characterize the banalities
I
of
was
the
going
week.
to say to Stephen, my wife says to me, emails drive you, and reading a certain type of book drives me, and things. So she bans that totally. And I kick for a while, but I do no emails on Sunday. And I don't read certain, sort of.
So it has to be set apart. So it has to be other.
I'll read
Other
fiction.
than.
I'll
Right,
read
other than
fiction.
and higher than.
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
so
That's right.
Right, so because we talked about the utility of ritual, and part of what we're hashing out here is the idea that in some sense the Sabbath is a ritual of not engaging in your normal sacrificial rituals. And so then what do you think about the idea that engaging in creative endeavor, I mean, because God is obviously in some fundamental sense a creator.
Right, but you can't create on Shabbat.
Kids, that's
The
it.
only
It's
thing
a
you
day
can
of rest
create
from
on Shabbat is a
creation.
baby.
It's a day of rest even from creation.
Well, I love the fact that the Hebrew, he rested. You get the idea in English, we need a breather.
Yeah.
Put my feet up a bit, I'm exhausted. Whereas the Hebrew, I understand, is completion, gratification, satisfaction. The creation was good.
Well, so I'm curious about this partly because it's not exactly obvious to me that I know how to rest. I don't know what it means. Well, I mean that. I mean
yeah,
that.
we know, Jordan.
Yeah.
We work
Because
that
I
one
get
out.
engaged in, I just seem to get engaged in some other
But
frenetic
back
activity.
to Genesis saying
and-
God created the world not by chance. You could say, and not through us only. That old cartoon, who will take care of the world after I've gone?
That's a good point.
We all think it all depends on me more than it really does. And Sabbath is saying, no, the Lord created it. I only
So
have a
you
small
said set
part.
apartness, but you also said something like
it doesn't depend on
reflective
you.
gratitude.
Jordan, doesn't depend on you, doesn't depend on me. And that's part of the humility that Stephen introduced earlier.
Is it the case that if we don't keep the Sabbath, because there's a sense in which work is instrumental, no matter how high or noble.
Right.
There's a sense in which, and you and I have talked a lot about coercion and instrumental, and what happens when you don't instrumentalize things. You know, they're free to become so much richer in that reciprocity than if you subordinate it to, I'm doing this because this person will give me that. And there's some sense in which I think this is a call not to instrumentalize your own life, and not to yourself to be instrumental, not yourself to be simply instrumentalized to a lower end. And it may be the case, certainly the experience of my life is, the less I stop, the more I forget what I really am. And I think the Sabbath is I think it is inevitable that we will lose ourselves in instrumentality if we do not stop to recollect that we have a higher end.
Yeah, and in terms of the idea of rest, I think it's important to understand, if you want to understand also what the Sabbath does, you can understand just what sleep does. You also need a transition between states in order for those states to be full. One of the problems we have, we're so frenetic, we just keep going and we're like these little wound up robots. But you have to take a pause between things in order for that to be complete and then for there to be a new beginning. And so I think that the Sabbath is obviously the highest version of that moment of stop, transition into the next one. But you experience that every day. Right? You work during the day, and in the evening you stop working, and then you go to bed and you start over. And you could bring that fractally all the way down into all your activities. If you sit at the dinner with your family and you haven't transitioned out of your work day in a little mini Sabbath, you're going to infect your family dinner with work, and that will ruin it. And so this idea of transitioning between states is very important.
Yeah. Well, it also means when you don't do that, you have an endless past in some sense, right? I mean, one of the great miracles, I would say, of sleep is that the horrors of the day are now behind you, right? So there's that break that enables you to distance yourself from the past, and then, as you said, to transition into the future. And that's associated with this idea of contaminating the next activity unless you can mark it with a transition. And the question is, so what do you do? What do you think you're doing exactly? You're working away, and then you decide to go and have dinner with your family. You have to make a little transition. What do you think you're doing in that transition that's akin to the Sabbath? Like, what do you...
Well, that's why you pray before you eat. It's good too. It's a nice transition.
Yeah, right, definitely.
But I think what you're doing, you're acknowledging the completion of something. And then you're taking a breather, and then you are beginning something new. So you're experiencing an end and a beginning.
Acknowledging the completion of something, right? So that's reverence towards what's already been created, right? So you're giving yourself a break in that sense, is that's enough. Maybe what I did for the week, if I did it in good faith, is enough.
It's amazing though how much it changes things. Because in a certain sense, your life is no different. You're still going to go around the other 6 days, go to your work and do your various daily tasks and rhythms and so on. But in another sense, it's totally different. I mean, the difference between having consciousness of a higher non-instrumental and a higher purpose to your life within your life versus not having that is everything.
Yeah, right, definitely.
It's a simple point, but this is an innovation, isn't it? I mean, no one else had a 7-day week and a rest like the Hebrews introduced. So as I understand
especially
it,
an innovation
the Babylonians
that also slaves
had a week.
Have it.
Yeah.
But in Babylon, the 7th day was a day of ill omens and curses. Whereas here, it's so positive. And the trouble is, we've turned it back into a legalistic negative.
There was a 19th century Jewish writer, Achad Ha'am, that was his nom de plume, which means one of the people. And he said something, and he wasn't even religious. He said, the Shabbat, the Sabbath, has watched over Israel far more than Israel has watched over the Shabbat. We wouldn't have survived without it. I totally believe it. It's the only ritual in the 10 Commandments. When I have always had non-Jews over for Shabbat dinner, always. In fact, it's a joke in my home. When my older son was about 8, he came over to me one Friday afternoon and he goes, "Dad, are any Jews coming over for Shabbos?" Totally cracked me up. And so almost always this reaction, you have this every Friday night? And it was like saying, yeah, we have Christmas every Friday night.
Right. Well, so that's a lovely way of conceptualizing, in some sense, of what the Sabbath could be. Is like maybe it could be the day that you could have if you got the day you wanted, And I don't mean in some instrumental sense, right? If you could have the day towards which all your instrumentality was hypothetically striving, what would that day look like? Well, gentlemen, that might be a good place.
We did
what,
the 5.
what commandment did we get to?
No, we did the 5.
But we sort of did 5 already.
We did 5 in advance.
Okay. Well, we hit the target today, and now it's time for a break. Well, okay. Well, thank you all for for participating once again. We haven't been together for a couple of months, and so we seem to take off more or less where we ended, and I'm delighted to see that. And thank you to the Daily Wire Plus people for making all of this possible, and to all of you who are watching and listening, your time and attention is much appreciated as we try to sort out these extraordinarily complicated matters in a manner that might be beneficial to each of us individually and all of us jointly. So, thank you.
Thank you.